For 2 years, Robert Morrison was under the impression that his wife dedicated her Wednesdays to reviewing documents for a consulting firm in Washington. The additional income was beneficial, the routine was steady, and he had no reason to doubt any of it until the night she failed to return home. What began as a quiet suspicion of infidelity would ultimately result in his wife being apprehended, and the unveiling of the fact that the woman he had been married to for 16 years had been leading a double life he could never have foreseen. On a Tuesday morning in early March 1980, Patricia Ann Morrison departed from her home in Baltimore at 7:15 a.m., precisely as she had done every weekday for the preceding 6 years. She was 34 years old, had been married to Robert Morrison, a regional sales manager for an agricultural equipment company for 16 years, and held the position of senior administrative clerk at Convergent Technologies, a defense contractor situated in an unremarkable office park. The employment was secure, the remuneration was adequate, and the work was sufficiently routine that Patricia seldom discussed it at home. Beyond general grievances about workplace politics or the occasional frustration with her supervisor, Robert Morrison adhered to a life of patterns and routines. He typically left for work at 8 a.m., returned by 6:30 p.m. on most evenings, played golf on Saturday mornings, and spent Sunday afternoons engaged in yard work or watching whatever sports broadcast was on television. Their 2 children, Jennifer, aged 13, and Michael, aged 11, navigated the challenges of adolescence with the customary blend of defiance and compliance. The Morrisons resembled most American families. They attended neighborhood gatherings, managed their mortgage payments punctually, and engaged in financial disputes with the same regularity and intensity as the majority of middle-class American families in 1980. In late March, Patricia attended a professional conference in Washington, specifically the annual security conference held at the Washington Hilton. This was a 3-day event featuring panels on emerging technologies, opportunities for professional networking, and the kind of corporate social engagement that Patricia typically found tiresome but professionally requisite. She returned home on the evening of March 14th with a collection of brochures, a hotel pen, and several business cards from vendors and consultants she had encountered during the conference sessions. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening in early April, Patricia informed her husband over supper that she had been approached about a part-time engagement. She explained that a consulting firm was seeking an individual with her background to review technical documentation once a week in Washington. The work would necessitate her taking the Mark, Maryland area rail commuter train into the city every Wednesday, spending a few hours at their office and returning home by evening. She mentioned that the compensation was generous, nearly equivalent to her full week's earnings at Convergent Technologies for a single day's work. Robert posed a few inquiries. He asked about the precise location of the office, the nature of the documents she would be reviewing, and whether this new role would be approved by her current employer. Patricia responded to each question with the casual assurance of someone who had already considered the logistics. The office, she stated, was situated near Union Station. The work entailed compliance reviews for European telecommunications standards, nothing that would jeopardize her security clearance or her responsibilities at Convergent, and she had already obtained approval from her supervisor. Robert encouraged her to accept the opportunity, acknowledging they could benefit from the additional income. College tuition was on the horizon, and if Patricia wished to dedicate her Wednesdays to consulting work, he saw no objection. Within 2 weeks, Patricia Morrison had established a new routine. Each Wednesday morning, she would depart from home at 9 a.m., drive to Penn Station in Baltimore, and board the MARC train bound for Washington's Union Station. The commute typically lasted approximately 50 minutes. She would return home by 7:30 p.m., occasionally earlier, occasionally later, depending on the train schedule. Over dinner, she would share brief anecdotes about her day, a challenging client, a particularly complex document, the city's weather, nothing that solicited further inquiry or appeared other than commonplace. For nearly 2 years, this routine persisted without deviation. Every Wednesday, Patricia Morrison traveled to Washington and returned home in the evening. The supplementary income was deposited into their checking account every 2 weeks, reliably. While Robert occasionally mused about the specifics of his wife's consulting endeavors, he never pressed for elaboration. She seemed content with the arrangement, perhaps even more so than before, and the financial stability enabled them to enhance their home, embark on a vacation to Florida one summer, and experienced less anxiety concerning the escalating expenses of raising two teenagers in Baltimore. Robert Morrison was not inherently a suspicious individual. He trusted his wife, believed in the fundamental stability of their marriage, and had no cause to question the Wednesday routine that had become as ordinary as grocery shopping or attending church on Sunday mornings. However, trust, even when warranted, can evolve into a form of obliviousness. Over the span of those nearly 2 years, minor instances accumulated in the periphery of Robert's awareness, details that were insignificant individually but would later fundamentally alter his perception of his wife. There were the new garments, not ostentatious but notably more stylish than Patricia's typical attire, dresses and blouses that seemed intended for a setting more significant than a consulting office. There were the infrequent phone conversations that would cease abruptly upon Robert's entry into the room. There were instances when Patricia would close a notebook or hastily tuck a piece of paper into her purse with a swiftness suggesting more than mere absent-mindedness. There were the Wednesdays when she returned home with a discernible radiance in her demeanor, an energy that seemed disproportionate to a day spent perusing compliance reports. And on other Wednesdays, she would return distant and preoccupied, responding to questions with monosyllables and retiring to the bedroom earlier than usual. Robert observed these occurrences with the passive attention one affords background details in a familiar life, without any particular alarm. When Jennifer once remarked that her mother had returned home smelling of cologne, Robert dismissed it as perfume from a department store Patricia might have visited. When Michael inquired why their mother needed to dress so elaborately for a job reviewing documents, Robert explained that professional environments necessitated a professional appearance. The human mind, when confronted with information that challenges established narratives, possesses a remarkable capacity for devising alternative explanations. Robert Morrison's mind devised these readily, with no conscious effort, smoothing over inconsistencies and preserving the comforting illusion that his life was precisely as it appeared. By the spring of 1982, Patricia Morrison had undertaken more than 90 journeys to Washington, deposited over $20,000 in consulting income into their joint checking account, and had provided Robert Morrison no explicit grounds for doubting the arrangement. However, on the evening of May 12, 1982, a Wednesday like any other, Patricia did not arrive home. 7:30 p.m. passed, then 8 p.m., then 8:30 p.m. Robert checked the answering machine, assuming perhaps Patricia had called while he was outside disposing of the trash cans, but there were no messages. By 9 p.m., he began to feel genuine concern. Patricia was never this late without making contact, and the train schedule she followed was predictable enough that a delay exceeding 90 minutes suggested a problem had occurred. He attempted to recall the name of the consulting firm where she worked, realizing with a jolt that he had never actually been told the name, only that it was located near Union Station. At 9:20 p.m., Robert contacted directory assistants and requested listings for consulting firms in the vicinity of Union Station in Washington. The operator provided 3 telephone numbers, none of which seemed remotely connected to telecommunications or compliance review. He dialed the first number and reached an answering service. He dialed the second and connected with a law office that had closed hours earlier. The third number went unanswered. He tried to recall any detail Patricia might have shared about the office, such as her supervisor's name or the floor of the building, anything that might assist him in locating her, and realized with growing unease that she had never provided such specifics, and he had never inquired. At 9:45 p.m., with no other options coming to mind, Robert called the MARC information line and inquired if there had been any delays on the evening trains departing from Washington towards Baltimore. The clerk confirmed that the 6:15 p.m. train had experienced mechanical difficulties and had been delayed by approximately 90 minutes. Relief washed over Robert, immediate and profound, followed almost instantaneously by embarrassment at his own excessive reaction. Patricia was simply delayed on a train, likely inconvenienced and uncomfortable, but perfectly safe, and he had worked himself into a state of near panic over nothing. At 10:05 p.m., Patricia walked through the front door, appearing fatigued and vexed. She apologized for not calling, explaining that the train had broken down at some point outside the city and that she had been stranded on it for over an hour. Robert embraced her, reassured her he had been worried, and mentioned that he had attempted to contact her office. Patricia became very still for a brief moment, then inquired which office he had called. Robert explained that he had tried directory assistance but could not recall the name of her firm. Patricia chuckled, a sound Robert found a touch too boisterous, explaining it was due to her employment with a small, unlisted firm engaged in highly specialized, discreet work for a select clientele, details unlikely to appear in any public directory. Robert accepted this reasoning with a nod, and the remainder of the evening unfolded without incident. They dined late, concluded a television program, and retired to bed shortly after 11 p.m. However, as Patricia drifted into sleep beside him, her breathing settling into the unhurried cadence of unconsciousness, Robert Morrison found himself unable to join her. He remained awake in the darkness, gazing at the ceiling. For the first time in nearly 2 years, he permitted himself to genuinely contemplate the Wednesday routine, to scrutinize it not as an established comfort, but as a succession of choices and claims that might not align as seamlessly as he had presumed. There was the consulting firm with no public listing, the substantial compensation for tasks that seemed trivial, the new attire, and the intermittent phone calls that ceased upon his entry into the room. He recalled Patricia's stillness when he mentioned contacting her office, the fleeting hesitation before she laughed and offered an explanation. These were minor points, each easily disregarded on its own, yet collectively they formed a pattern that Robert could no longer overlook. He tried to rationalize his unease as paranoia, attributing his suspicions to the evening's stress, but the thoughts persisted, unwelcome and insistent. By 2 a.m., Robert Morrison had become convinced of his wife's infidelity. Once conceived, the idea proved immutable. In the subsequent days, Robert found himself re-examining the previous 2 years with fresh perspective, reinterpreting every detail through the lens of an extramarital affair. The Wednesday routine was not a consulting engagement, but a regular rendezvous with another man. The supplementary income was not remuneration for document review, but funds procured from an alternative source, perhaps a wealthy paramour, or possibly savings from her regular salary, strategically set aside to sustain the facade of external employment. The new clothing was not professional attire, but the wardrobe of a woman involved in a clandestine relationship. Her periods of distant moods upon returning home were not professional frustrations, but the emotional complexities of maintaining a dual existence. Robert Morrison was not an inherently confrontational individual. He did not immediately demand disclosure, issue threats of divorce, or enact any of the actions typically depicted in media for a spouse who felt betrayed. Instead, he arrived at a decision that, in the moment, seemed both logical and essential. He would discreetly follow Patricia to Washington on her next journey, observe her destinations and acquaintances, and gather evidence before lodging any accusations. This resolve stemmed not from a desire to catch her in the act, but from a desperate hope that his suspicions were unfounded, that trailing her would reveal nothing more illicit than a legitimate consulting job and a series of coincidental occurrences misinterpreted by an overtired, anxious mind. On Wednesday, May the 19th, 1982, precisely 1 week later, Patricia Morrison departed their residence at 9 a.m. Robert Morrison contacted his office, informing his secretary of his absence for the day due to a personal matter, and proceeded to Penn Station in Baltimore. He procured a ticket for the same Amtrak train Patricia had boarded, the 9:45 southbound service to Washington, and occupied a seat in the rear car while Patricia sat in the car ahead. The 50-minute journey felt agonizingly long. Robert kept his newspaper held aloft, his face partially concealed, and watched through the gap between seats as passengers moved through the aisles, consumed by the fear that Patricia might walk through the car and identify him. However, once the train arrived at Union Station and he observed Patricia ascending the stairs, he recognized it as his signal to follow. Patricia exited Union Station and commenced walking eastward along Massachusetts Avenue. Robert shadowed her on the opposite side of the street, maintaining a distance of approximately half a block, striving to appear nonchalant while ensuring she remained within his sight. She proceeded for 3 blocks, turned south onto North Capitol Street, and then veered onto a narrower side street bordered by brownstones and small office buildings. Robert's pulse quickened. This was not the trajectory of someone headed to a professional office. This behavior suggested someone consciously avoiding detection, someone intimately familiar with the city's byways, someone exercising caution. For the subsequent 2 hours, Patricia ambled. She paused periodically to examine shop windows, perused a newsstand, and sat for 15 minutes on a bench in Stanton Park, engrossed in a newspaper. Robert observed from various concealed vantage points: a bus stop, a coffee shop, the entrance to a library. With each passing minute, his conviction in the correctness of his suspicions deepened. No one engaged in legitimate business conducted themselves in such a manner. She was deliberately passing time, ensuring she was unobserved. At 12:40 p.m., Patricia entered Feuillet Park, a small green space ringed by row houses and tree-lined streets, and sat on a bench situated near the park's center. Robert positioned himself behind a substantial oak tree, roughly 50 yards distant, partially shielded by the trunk, but retaining a clear view of the bench. 10 minutes elapsed, then 15. Precisely at 1 p.m., a man approached the bench and sat down beside Patricia. He was tall, appearing to be in his mid-40s, attired in a dark suit and carrying a folded newspaper beneath his arm. From his vantage point, Robert could not discern the man's features clearly, but he could observe their body language. The manner in which the man angled himself slightly toward Patricia, the way they appeared to converse in hushed tones, the inclination of their heads toward one another in a posture suggestive of intimacy, conspiracy, or both. Robert felt a tightening in his stomach, a bitter confirmation of his forebodings, and compelled himself to continue observing. Their conversation lasted approximately 5 minutes. Patricia then reached into her purse, retrieved what seemed to be a small manila envelope, and handed it to the man. He accepted the envelope, opened it partially, glanced at its contents, and then reached into his own jacket pocket, producing a white envelope, which he gave to Patricia. She took it, placed it in her purse without unfolding it, and then both individuals rose. The man proceeded northward toward East Capitol Street. Patricia walked southward toward the park entrance. The entire transaction had transpired in less than 10 minutes. Robert waited until both had departed the park, then followed Patricia at a distance as she made her way back to Union Station. She paused at a bookstore for 20 minutes, browsed the newsstand, had a coffee, and finally entered the station at 5:40 p.m. Robert observed from the main concourse as she boarded the 6:15 Amtrak train bound for Baltimore. He boarded the same train, again occupying a seat in the rear car, his heart pounding with apprehension of discovery. The 50-minute return journey was fraught with tension. Robert sat facing away from Patricia's direction of seating, his jaw set, his hands gripping the armrests, attempting to process his observations. An envelope exchanged for an envelope, a brief meeting in a public park, a man in a suit whose face Robert had not clearly seen. It bore the appearance of an affair, yet something about the exchange troubled him, an element that did not align with the paradigm of romantic infidelity. The entire interaction had been excessively brief, too businesslike, too meticulously scheduled. The train arrived at Penn Station at 7:05 p.m. Patricia disembarked and proceeded swiftly to her vehicle in the station's parking garage. Robert waited, allowing her to drive away, then walked to his own car several rows over. However, instead of proceeding directly home, he opted for a more circuitous route through the city, deliberately consuming time to ensure his arrival appeared natural, unconnected to Patricia's return, thereby preserving the pretense that he had been elsewhere entirely. Robert pulled into the driveway at 7:40 p.m. and entered through the front door with the casual demeanor of someone who had spent the day engaged in precisely the activities he had claimed. Patricia inquired about his whereabouts. He informed her that he had met some friends for drinks after work and lost track of time. She nodded, remarking that her day had been uneventful, characterized by the usual document review. Robert asked if she wished to order takeout for dinner. She responded that it sounded perfect. They consumed Chinese food while watching television, and Robert made no mention of his observations, spending the remainder of the evening in a state of uncertainty and escalating dread. Over the ensuing 2 weeks, Robert Morrison tailed his wife on 2 additional occasions. On May 26th, Patricia took the Amtrak train to Washington, walked through the city for approximately an hour, stopped at a drugstore and a bookshop, lunched alone at a sandwich counter near Union Station, and returned home on the evening train without meeting anyone or engaging in any activity that appeared in the least bit suspect. Robert followed her on the same train in both directions, consistently occupying a different car and always holding a newspaper or book aloft to obscure his face. Upon their arrival back in Baltimore, He allowed her to exit the station first, waited 15 minutes, and then drove home. He entered the house at 8:10 p.m., informing Patricia he had been at the driving range and apologizing for missing dinner. On June the 2nd, the pattern replicated with remarkable similarity. Patricia took the morning train. She wandered aimlessly through Washington for hours, met no one, engaged in no suspicious activities, and they both returned on the evening train. This time, Robert ensured he arrived home before her. He departed Penn Station immediately after the train's arrival, drove at speeds that unsettled him, and entered the house 10 minutes prior to Patricia's expected arrival. Upon her arrival home, he was already clad in loungewear, inquiring about her day. She responded that it had been uneventful, nothing out of the ordinary, and retired to the bedroom to change. Robert began to question his observations in Feuillier Park. Perhaps it had been innocent, a serendipitous meeting with an old acquaintance, a former colleague from the consulting firm, someone who was repaying a debt to Patricia. It was possible the entire incident was a misinterpretation amplified by his own overactive imagination. Yet, he couldn't shake it. The image of the envelope passing from Patricia's hand to the stranger's replayed endlessly in his mind. Each time he looked at his wife, whenever she offered him a smile, a goodnight kiss, or asked about his day, he felt the oppressive weight of his own ignorance. On June 9th, Robert trailed Patricia for the 4th time. The morning unfolded precisely as it had during the previous stakeouts. Patricia boarded the 9:45 a.m. train, disembarking at Union Station 50 minutes later to commence her now familiar routine of traversing the neighboring districts. Robert followed, weary from the repetition, half hoping that nothing significant would occur, allowing him to finally dismiss his suspicions and revert to the comfortable unawareness that had underpinned their nearly 2-year marriage. Shortly before 1 p.m., Patricia entered Feuillier Park. Robert's chest tightened. She proceeded to the same bench where she had met the man 3 weeks prior and took a seat. Robert positioned himself behind the familiar oak tree, his heart pounding, and waited. 5 minutes elapsed, then 10. At precisely 1 p.m., the same man approached the bench. This time, Robert was close enough to discern more details. The man was tall, approximately 6 feet, with dark hair showing gray at the temples, and possessed a lean, angular face. He wore a different suit than on the previous occasion, but carried himself with the same deliberate posture and controlled demeanor. He sat beside Patricia, and they conversed for roughly 3 minutes. Patricia then retrieved a manila envelope from her purse and handed it to the man. He accepted it, briefly examined its contents, and presented her with a white envelope in return. However, as the man rose to depart, Patricia's head turned toward the oak tree where Robert stood. For a fleeting instant, their eyes met, and Robert witnessed the immediate, unmistakable flash of recognition across her face. Patricia stood abruptly, uttered something to the man that Robert couldn't hear, and the man's head also turned toward the tree. He left the manila envelope on the bench, turned, and walked away swiftly, his pace just shy of a run. Patricia remained motionless for a moment, gazing directly at Robert, then began walking toward him with a deliberate, measured gait, suggesting she had already determined the ensuing course of action. Robert stepped out from behind the tree, his legs trembling, his mouth dry, bracing himself for the confrontation he had simultaneously dreaded and anticipated for 3 weeks. Patricia halted 3 feet from her husband, close enough for them to converse without raising their voices, yet maintaining a palpable distance, both physically and otherwise. Her expression was pale but serene, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, almost detached. She inquired how long he had been following her. Robert, caught off guard by the directness of the question, stammered that this was the 4th instance. Patricia nodded, as if confirming a pre-existing calculation, and asked why he hadn't simply confronted her at home. Robert found his voice, demanding to know what she was doing, who the man was, and what was inside the envelopes. Patricia glanced back at the bench where the manila envelopes still lay, dropped and forgotten in the man's hurried exit. Something in her expression shifted. She suddenly appeared profoundly weary, as though a burden she had carried for years had finally become unbearable. She instructed Robert to retrieve the envelope. He asked why. She reiterated, more firmly this time, to pick up the envelope, assuring him they would talk afterward. Robert approached the bench, his hands shaking, and picked up the manila envelope. It was unsealed. He opened it, revealing 3 pages covered in technical diagrams, dense blocks of text, and what appeared to be circuit schematics. The header on the first page read, "Convergent Technologies Classified." Robert stared at the pages, his mind struggling to comprehend the information before him, then looked up at Patricia, his expression now one of pure, uncomprehending shock rather than anger or betrayal. Patricia instructed him to return the papers to the envelope and follow her. She exited the park, turned onto a quiet residential street bordered by parked cars and deserted sidewalks, and stopped beneath the awning of a closed storefront. Robert followed, clutching the envelope, and demanded an explanation. Patricia took a breath, met her husband's gaze directly, and revealed that for the past 2 years she had been supplying classified documents from Convergent Technologies to Soviet intelligence officers. The man in the park was her contact, or, more accurately, one of several intermediaries responsible for collecting the materials she provided and delivering her payment. She had been recruited at a conference in March 1980, began passing documents in April of that year, and had continued uninterrupted for 26 months. Her consulting position was a fabrication. The Wednesday excursions to Washington served as dead drops, or if she had no materials to pass that week, a means to maintain her cover story. The surplus income in their checking account represented payment from the Soviet Union for information ranging from technical specifications for secure communication systems to project timelines for military contracts and lists of personnel holding security clearances. Robert felt the ground shift beneath him. He asked her to repeat what she had said, certain he had misheard or misinterpreted. But Patricia simply reiterated the same information in the same calm, factual tone. She was a spy. She had been a spy for 2 years. The $20,000 that had funded their vacation, home improvements, and Jennifer's braces had originated from the Soviet Union in exchange for materials likely intended to compromise American defense capabilities. Robert's first coherent thought emerging from the mental turmoil was to ask why. Patricia's answer was simple, almost starkly so. Money. They had required funds. They would consistently require funds. And when the opportunity presented itself, she had made a choice. The work was not challenging. The risk seemed manageable, and the remuneration far exceeded anything she could earn through permissible means. She had rationalized it as a victimless offense, documents that Soviet intelligence likely already possessed through alternative channels, information valuable primarily for its classified status rather than its intrinsic content. However, as the months progressed and the materials she provided grew more sensitive, the rationalization became increasingly untenable, and she found herself ensnared in a predicament from which she neither could extricate herself nor fully justify. Robert questioned if she comprehended the gravity of her actions, if she grasped the magnitude of her betrayal, not only to him, but to the nation and the individuals whose lives might be endangered by the information she had disseminated. Patricia affirmed that she understood, and that was the reason for her weariness. It explained why she sometimes returned from Washington distant and withdrawn. Understanding and ceasing were distinct actions, and she had been unable to cease. They stood beneath the storefront awning for 40 minutes, conversing in hushed, urgent tones as the reality of their situation settled upon them like a layer of ash. Robert inquired about the ramifications if he were to approach the authorities. If he were to enter an FBI office and disclose everything Patricia had just confessed. Patricia stated that she would be apprehended, almost certainly convicted of espionage, and sentenced to a substantial prison term, potentially life imprisonment. She added that Robert himself could face accessory charges if investigators believed he had been aware of her activities and had failed to report them. She asked if he had confided in anyone about following her, if anyone was aware of his presence there. Robert replied in the negative. He had told no one, fabricating an excuse at work regarding a personal matter. Patricia informed him that they had a choice. They could terminate this immediately, proceed to an FBI office and accept the consequences, or they could return home, feign ignorance regarding this conversation, and persist as before. Robert, his mind reeling, asked how she could possibly suggest continuation, how she expected him to live with this knowledge and remain inactive. Patricia pointed out that they had already been coexisting with it for 2 years. The sole difference now was Robert's awareness, and the money would continue to arrive in their checking account bi-weekly, precisely as it always had. The ensuing conversation was devoid of the dramatic flair of spy thrillers or the moral certitude of courtroom dramas. It evolved into an uncomfortable, arduous negotiation, wherein Robert Morrison grappled with the practical implications of his own complicity and the financial advantages that had accrued from his wife's transgressions. Patricia presented the financial details with unvarnished honesty. They had received $20,000 over 2 years, had expended the majority on items they could not have otherwise afforded, and if she continued, they would have sufficient savings within another year to fund their children's college education without recourse to loans. She inquired of Robert if he was ready to articulate to his daughter the reasons behind her inability to attend her preferred university, the financial strain on their family that prevented it, and why such obstacles seemed easily overcome by other families in their neighborhood, all stemming from a discovery he could have perpetually ignored. Robert recognized at that juncture that his wife was not seeking absolution or empathy. She was demanding a definitive choice, a pragmatic assessment of repercussions and advantages, and she was phrasing it in a manner that rendered refusal not principled, but imprudent. He questioned how much longer she intended to persist. Patricia stated she was unaware the arrangement lacked a defined termination point, but assured him she would exercise caution, avoid undue hazards, and cease if she perceived any threat of exposure. The resolution Robert Morrison reached in that moment was not fueled by avarice or ethical indifference, though both played a role. It was born from profound weariness, from the realization that the existence he believed he was leading was a fabrication, and that the choice confronting him was not between rectitude and transgression, but between two distinct forms of devastation. He could betray Patricia and dismantle his family instantly, or he could maintain silence and hope that destruction could be indefinitely deferred. He opted for silence. They journeyed back to Union Station collectively, boarded the 4:30 MARC train bound for Baltimore, and shared the 50-minute commute home in silence. Robert gazed out the window at the passing industrial scenery, the sprawling rail yards, warehouses, and the rear facades of terraced houses, experiencing a fundamental fracture within himself. That evening, they dined with their children, watched television, and retired at their accustomed hour. Robert remained awake beside his wife, feeling the weight of his decision embed itself deep within him, and understood that he had transformed into someone he had never envisioned, not a paragon of virtue, but an accessory. For the subsequent 8 months, the Wednesday ritual persisted. Patricia Morrison commuted via the MARC train to Washington weekly, rendezvoused with her contacts to relay information, and returned home with white envelopes which she deposited into bank accounts bi-monthly. Robert Morrison attended work, returned home, played golf on Saturdays, and harbored a secret that tainted every interaction with his spouse, progeny, colleagues, and himself. They meticulously preserved the guise of normalcy with the same dedication that Patricia maintained the pretense of her consulting position, and for 8 months it nearly succeeded. The misstep, when it occurred, was minor and largely unavoidable. In January, a standard security assessment at Convergent Technologies highlighted an anomaly within the document control logs. A solitary page was absent from a file that was meant to comprise 47 pages. While missing pages were not an unusual occurrence in the milieu of a defense contractor managing numerous classified initiatives, this specific page had been removed for duplication by Patricia Morrison 2 weeks prior to the audit. She had duly signed the log and returned the file with all pages accounted for, according to her own annotation. Yet, the physical inventory did not align with the documentation. The security officer who identified this discrepancy brought it to the attention of the facility security manager, who, in turn, alerted the Defense Investigative Service, the entity tasked with investigating security breaches at defense contractors. An investigator interviewed Patricia on January 19th, posing standard inquiries regarding her document handling protocols, her recollection of duplicating that particular page, and the possibility of misfiling it or inadvertently leaving it in a copier. Patricia responded composedly. She stated she did not specifically recall that document, but that she processed scores of documents weekly, and acknowledged it was conceivable she might have erred. The investigator expressed gratitude for her time, and indicated the matter would likely resolve itself once the missing page surfaced in another individual's file or in the recycling receptacle. However, the missing page never reappeared. A more exhaustive inquiry uncovered 2 additional irregularities in files that Patricia had accessed over the preceding 6 months, both involving pages that had been logged out, copied, and returned according to the records, but could not be located during a physical inventory. The Defense Investigative Service broadened its scope of inquiry, commenced a more systematic review of Patricia's access history, and on February 3rd, contacted the FBI with a recommendation that Patricia Ann Morrison be placed under surveillance for potential espionage. The FBI initiated a case file, assigned a team of counterintelligence agents to observe Patricia's movements, and within a week had captured photographic evidence of her meeting with a known Soviet intelligence operative in Washington, D.C. An arrest warrant was subsequently issued, and federal agents arrived at the Morrison residence at precisely 6:30 on a cold February morning as Patricia was preparing coffee and Robert was perusing the newspaper at the kitchen table. They identified themselves, informed Patricia of her rights, and placed her in restraints. Patricia Ann Morrison was found guilty in federal court in October 1983 on 7 counts of espionage and received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. Robert Morrison, following extensive collaboration with federal investigators and testimony confirming he had only learned of his wife's clandestine activities prior to her apprehension, was convicted of misprision of felony and sentenced to 5 years, 32 months, of which he served before being released on parole. The Morrison children, Jennifer and Michael, were placed under the guardianship of Robert's brother in Pennsylvania, while their father served his sentence. The row house located in Baltimore was confiscated as proceeds derived from criminal activity and subsequently sold at auction. The sum of $23,000, which had accumulated in the Morrison family's checking account over nearly 3 years, was forfeited to the federal government. Patricia Morrison served 18 years of her sentence before being granted parole in 2001. Robert Morrison, who divorced his wife while both were incarcerated, succumbed to a heart attack in 2007, having never publicly disclosed the events that precipitated the ruin of his family. Ultimately, the Wednesday train that had transported Patricia Morrison to Washington for nearly 3 years had conveyed her not to a consulting engagement or an illicit liaison, but to a federal penitentiary, and her husband, who had loved her sufficiently to follow her path, and had compromised himself enough to maintain silence, had accompanied her there as well.